The Mediterranean Sea has often been called Mare Nostrum, our sea. And for the Romans, this was more than a poetic phrase. It was a declaration of power. For centuries, the might of Rome was carried not only by its legions on land, but also by the ships that sailed across the blue waters of the Mediterranean. Roman warships were the tools of conquest, instruments of trade protection, and symbols of imperial dominance. They were not merely vessels of wood and sail. They were weapons forged to secure Rome's supremacy in an age when control of the sea was as vital as control of the land. This is the story of those ships, how they were designed, built, and crewed, how they fought in legendary battles against Carthage and other rivals, and how they became the backbone of an empire that transformed the ancient world. Early Rome and its rivals. In its earliest centuries, Rome was not a naval power. The city rose inland along the banks of the Tiber, far removed from the great seafaring traditions of the Greeks, Venetians, and Carthaginians. For much of its early history, Rome's strength lay in its legions, not in its ships. But the Mediterranean world was dominated by those who commanded the waves. The Greeks had perfected the trireme, a sleek warship powered by banks of oars. The Phoenicians, and later their descendants in Carthage, mastered long-distance trade and naval warfare, building mighty fleets that patrolled the western Mediterranean. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome had grown into a formidable land power, extending its control across much of the Italian peninsula. But when Rome clashed with Carthage, the great maritime empire of North Africa, the Romans discovered that they could not hope to win supremacy without a fleet of their own. The First Punic War. The First Punic War, 264 to 241 BCE, marked Rome's true introduction to naval warfare. At the outset, Rome had only a handful of ships, little experience at sea, and no tradition of naval combat. Carthage, by contrast, commanded one of the most powerful navies in the world. Yet, Rome's adaptability was legendary. According to tradition, when the Romans captured a stranded Carthaginian quinquereme, they used it as a model to build their own fleet. Within months, shipyards along the Italian coast were constructing hundreds of warships, each one a near replica of the Carthaginian design. It was in this crucible of necessity that Rome's naval tradition was born. And once Rome set its mind to the mastery of the sea, it would never let go. Building Rome's fleet from scratch. Rome's transformation into a naval power was nothing short of remarkable. Before the Punic Wars, Roman shipbuilding was modest at best, confined largely to rivercraft and small coastal vessels. But when confronted by the Carthaginian threat, Rome rapidly mobilized its resources. The story is often told that the Romans captured a Carthaginian quinquereme that had run aground and used it as a model. Roman shipwrights, unaccustomed to building such complex vessels, carefully copied its proportions, using it as a floating blueprint. Shipyards across Italy, from Ostia to Neapolis to the ports of Sicily, were suddenly alive with the sound of axes, saws, and hammers. Timber was felled in great quantities from Italy's forests, especially pine and fir for the hulls, oak for the frames, and lighter woods for decking and interior fittings. Thousands of laborers, craftsmen, and slaves worked in concert, guided by Greek and Carthaginian experts who had long experience in naval construction. Within a year, Rome had constructed a fleet of over 100 warships, a feat of logistical brilliance that astonished even their enemies. The trireme, legacy of the Greeks. The trireme, the warship of classical Greece, formed the basis of many Roman designs. Sleek and narrow, about 37 meters in length, it carried 3 banks of oars on each side, manned by roughly 170 rowers. It was light, fast, and highly maneuverable, designed for one purpose: to ram enemy ships with its bronze-sheathed prow. Rome inherited the trireme design, but soon realized that against Carthage's heavier quinqueremes, it needed something more robust. The quinquereme, Rome's warhorse. The quinquereme became the backbone of Rome's navy during the Punic Wars. Larger than the trireme, about 45 meters long, it could carry up to 300 rowers, along with 120 marines and deck crew. Contrary to what the name might suggest, it did not have 5 banks of oars. Instead, it arranged oarsmen in groups of 5 per vertical section, allowing for greater power without excessive height. These ships were not only stronger, but also more versatile. They could deliver devastating ramming attacks, carry soldiers for boarding actions, and serve as floating platforms for siege engines such as catapults and ballistae. Innovation. The corvus. Perhaps the most famous Roman naval innovation was the corvus, or crow. This was a boarding device, essentially a long gangplank fitted with a heavy spike. When lowered onto an enemy ship, the spike would bite into the deck, locking the 2 vessels together. Roman legionaries, trained for land combat, could then storm across and fight as if on solid ground. The corvus neutralized Carthage's superior seamanship, turning naval battles into infantry clashes, a type of combat Rome excelled at. Though the device had drawbacks, especially in rough seas, it gave Rome the tactical edge it needed in the early stages of the Punic Wars. Shipyards and organization. By the height of Rome's naval power, shipyards were vast industrial complexes. They included slipways for launching, dry docks for repairs, warehouses for sails and rigging, and forges for producing bronze rams and fittings. Naval bases such as Misenum and Ravenna became permanent centers of Roman maritime power, housing fleets that could deploy rapidly to any corner of the empire. Ship construction was not just about building vessels, it was about building systems of supply, training, and logistics. Rome, with its mastery of organization, excelled in creating fleets that were not only large but also sustainable over decades of conflict. Size and proportions. Roman warships were designed with precision, balancing speed, strength, and stability. The smallest of their common war galleys, such as the trireme, measured around 35 to 37 meters in length and 4 to 5 meters in beam. The larger quinqueremes extended to 40 to 45 meters long, with beams closer to 6 meters. These dimensions allowed enough space for multiple banks of oarsmen, while keeping the hull narrow enough to cut through the sea with remarkable agility. The hulls were long and sleek, their prows sharp and fitted with bronze rams called rostra. These rams were designed not only to pierce but also to weaken enemy hulls by splitting planks or tearing open seams beneath the waterline. Propulsion, oars and sails. Like their Greek predecessors, Roman warships relied primarily on human power. Oars provided the speed and maneuverability necessary for combat. Each quinquereme carried approximately 300 rowers, seated in staggered tiers. Contrary to popular belief, most of these men were not slaves but free citizens, allies, or auxiliaries, often trained specifically for the fleet. Above the rowers stood 1 or 2 masts fitted with square sails. These were used for long voyages, allowing ships to harness the wind across open waters. In battle, however, sails were usually lowered and stowed, leaving the ship dependent on its rowers for maximum control. Crew and complement A. Typical quinquereme carried not only rowers, but also 120 marines, heavily armed soldiers ready to fight during boarding actions, officers and helmsmen who directed maneuvers, specialists such as carpenters, sailmakers, and trumpeters who signaled commands. In total, a fully manned quinquereme might carry over 400 men, each with a specific role in the synchronized ballet of naval combat. Armament and deck features. Roman warships were not floating fortresses like medieval galleons. They were sleek, offensive machines. Their weapons were a combination of the ship itself and the men aboard. The ram, rostrum, a bronze-tipped weapon affixed to the prow, intended to smash through enemy hulls. Boarding devices, most famously the corvus, which turned sea battles into land battles. Missile weapons. Catapults and ballistae could be mounted on the deck, hurling stones, bolts, or even incendiary projectiles at enemy vessels. Archers and slingers added to this ranged barrage, speed and maneuverability. Roman warships were impressively fast for their size. A trireme could sustain speeds of 7 to 8 knots, while a quinquereme under full rowing force might reach 10 knots in bursts. Maneuvers were sharp and decisive, with experienced crews able to perform the famed diecplus, breaking through enemy lines, or periplus, outflanking and circling an opponent. The price of such performance, however, was endurance. Rowers could only maintain battle pace for short periods before fatigue set in. This is why timing and command were critical. Battles were often decided in the first furious exchanges, innovations and adaptations. The genius of Roman naval design lay not just in the ships themselves, but in their adaptability. Rome borrowed heavily from Greek and Carthaginian models, but improved them to fit its own needs. The quinquereme became the standard heavy warship, versatile enough for both ramming and boarding. Lighter crafts such as the Liburnian, a fast two-banked galley, were adopted from Illyrian pirates and used later in patrol and escort roles. Roman fleets standardized their designs, ensuring that replacements could be built quickly and crews could adapt seamlessly from one vessel to another. In this way, Roman warships became not just tools of battle, but symbols of Rome's capacity to absorb, refine, and dominate. The first trials, the Punic Wars. Rome's first true naval campaigns came during the First Punic War, 264 to 241 BCE, a conflict fought for supremacy over Sicily. Carthage, long the master of the sea, possessed hundreds of ships, expert crews, and centuries of experience. Rome had the enthusiasm of its people, its shipyards, and the iron discipline of its legions. But little else. Yet Rome's genius lay in its adaptability. Instead of trying to outmaneuver Carthage's seasoned sailors, the Romans invented the corvus boarding bridge, turning naval encounters into infantry clashes. In battles such as Mylae, 260 BCE, Roman ships grappled their enemies, dropped the corvus, and allowed legionaries to storm aboard. For the first time, Rome defeated Carthage at sea. This was only the beginning. The Punic Wars became the testing ground where Rome honed its naval skills. Battles raged across the waters around Sicily, Sardinia, and North Africa. Rome lost fleets to storms and inexperience, but always built more, until sheer persistence and logistical strength brought victory. The rise of Roman naval power. By the Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BCE, Rome had transformed. No longer a novice, the Republic commanded fleets capable of patrolling vast stretches of the Mediterranean. While Hannibal threatened Italy on land, Roman warships cut off his supply lines at sea, striking Carthaginian ports and escorting Roman armies across to Spain and Africa. At the Battle of the Ebro River, 217 BCE, Roman ships ambushed and destroyed a Carthaginian fleet, crippling Hannibal's reinforcements. Later, the Roman navy supported Scipio Africanus in his campaigns in Iberia and ultimately in North Africa, paving the way for the decisive Battle of Zama, 202 BCE, on land. By the end of the Second Punic War, Carthage's naval supremacy was broken forever. The Mediterranean was beginning to echo with a new name, Mare Nostrum, our sea. The expansion. Across the Mediterranean, with Carthage defeated, Rome turned its attention to the eastern Mediterranean. Wars with Macedonia, the Seleucid Empire, and various Greek states brought Roman fleets into contact with the great naval traditions of the Hellenistic world. At the Battle of Cynocephalae, 1977 BCE, and later the Battle of Magnesia, 190 BCE, Roman naval forces worked alongside legions to transport troops, blockade cities, and engage enemy fleets. The quinquereme remained the workhorse of the navy, but Rome began to adopt lighter and faster vessels, especially for patrol and piracy suppression. Piracy and the Liburnian advantage. By the 1st century BCE, piracy had grown rampant in the eastern Mediterranean, threatening Rome's trade and grain supply. Traditional heavy quinqueremes were too slow to chase agile pirate ships. The solution came in the form of the Liburnian galley, a swift, two-banked vessel originally used by Illyrian pirates themselves. Rome adopted the design, and it proved so effective that the Liburnian became a standard ship of the imperial navy. Under leaders like Pompey the Great, Rome launched massive anti-pirate campaigns, sweeping the seas clean in only a few months. The civil wars and the Battle of Actium, perhaps the most famous naval clash in Roman history, was the Battle of Actium, 31 BCE, fought between the forces of Octavian and the combined fleets of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Octavian's fleet, commanded by Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, employed lighter and more maneuverable ships against Antony's massive but unwieldy war galleys. The battle was fierce, fought in the waters off the western coast of Greece, but Agrippa's tactics and discipline prevailed. Antony and Cleopatra fled, their fleet in ruins, and Octavian emerged as master of Rome. With Actium, the Republic ended and the empire began. Control of the sea had once again determined the fate of nations. The Battle of Mylae, 260 BCE, the Battle of Mylae, fought during the First Punic War, marked Rome's very first great naval victory. Facing the seasoned Carthaginian fleet, the Romans deployed their new invention, the corvus boarding bridge. As the Carthaginian ships attempted to ram, the Romans dropped their corvi onto enemy decks. The iron spikes bit into the wood, locking the vessels together. Legionaries stormed across in disciplined formations, transforming a naval encounter into a land battle at sea. Carthage's skilled sailors suddenly found themselves overwhelmed in hand-to-hand combat. Rome captured or destroyed over 50 enemy vessels. The victory electrified the Republic and proved that with ingenuity, Rome could match even the greatest naval powers. The Battle of Ecnomus, 256 BCE. The Battle of Ecnomus, also in the First Punic War, was one of the largest naval battles in history, involving more than 600 ships and nearly 300,000 men. The Carthaginian fleet attempted to block Rome's crossing to Africa, forming a massive crescent formation. But the Roman consuls Marcus Atilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius Vulso commanded their fleets with discipline, creating a wedge formation to punch through the enemy line. Once again, the corvus gave Rome the advantage. Ship after ship was grappled and boarded until Carthage's fleet broke apart. The victory allowed the Romans to land an army in Africa. Though Regulus's campaign would later end in disaster, the battle itself demonstrated Rome's mastery of naval logistics and combat. Storms and the wrath of the sea. Yet Rome's naval dominance was never without peril. Time and again, fleets were lost not to enemy action but to storms. Ancient sources tell of tempests that sank hundreds of Roman ships in a single night. During the First Punic War, one storm reportedly destroyed over 100,000 Roman lives at sea, as fragile ships overloaded with men and supplies capsized in the fury of the waves. These disasters were as devastating as any battle, a reminder that the Mediterranean, though called Mare Nostrum, was never truly tame. The Battle of Actium, 31 BCE. The climax of Rome's naval history came at Actium, a decisive confrontation between Octavian and Mark Antony, supported by Cleopatra of Egypt. Antony's fleet consisted of massive war galleys, towering and heavily armed. Octavian's fleet, under the brilliant command of Agrippa, was lighter and more maneuverable, composed largely of Liburnians. As the fleets clashed in the Ionian Sea, Antony's ships struggled to maneuver, while Agrippa's vessels darted in and out, cutting supply lines and harassing the larger galleys. Cleopatra's sudden retreat from the battle, followed by Antony, sealed their fate. Their fleet collapsed, and Octavian became sole ruler of Rome. Actium was more than a battle. It was a turning point in history. With it, the Republic ended, and the Roman Empire was born, its foundations resting on both land and sea power. Legends and myths of the Roman Navy. In later centuries, the exploits of Rome's fleets became the stuff of legend. Stories told of ghostly ships seen after great battles, of divine interventions during storms, and of Neptune himself testing Rome's might. Sailors spoke of the sacred rostra, the bronze rams of captured enemy ships, which were displayed in the Roman Forum as symbols of victory. These artifacts reminded every citizen that the Republic's power stretched not just across the land, but across the endless horizon of the sea. Warships in Roman memory. The power of Rome's navy was not forgotten once the seas grew quieter under imperial rule. Victories won at sea were carved into marble, celebrated in triumphs, and remembered in stone inscriptions across the empire. Naval victories were immortalized in monuments such as the rostra in the Roman Forum, decorated with the bronze rams of enemy ships. These trophies were not simply relics, they were public symbols of Rome's mastery over foreign nations and over the sea itself. Naval motifs appeared in coins, sculptures, and mosaics. Images of prows, anchors, and sea creatures reminded Romans that their empire rested on maritime strength. Even the architectural vocabulary of Rome carried this symbolism. Theaters and basilicas sometimes incorporated naval themes, blending land and sea in the imagery of imperial power. Literature and the voice of history. Roman authors also recorded the navy's triumphs. Historians such as Polybius, Livy, and Cassius Dio wrote detailed accounts of the Punic Wars and the rise of Roman sea power. Their works described not only battles, but also the political debates surrounding the fleet, the immense costs of maintaining ships, the training of rowers, and the toll of storms and disasters. Poets and rhetoricians, meanwhile, often used naval imagery as metaphors for human ambition and destiny. The sea represented both opportunity and peril, and the warship became a symbol of Roman resilience, a machine that cut through the waves as the empire itself cut through the world's resistance. The imperial fleets. Under the empire, the navy became less about conquest and more about security. Fleets based at Misenum and Ravenna patrolled the Mediterranean, protecting grain routes from Egypt, suppressing piracy, and ensuring swift movement of troops. The Classis Britannica guarded the English Channel, while the Classis Germanica patrolled the Rhine. These fleets maintained the peace of the empire, the Pax Romana, by ensuring that no rival could threaten Rome's lifelines. Though they seldom fought battles on the scale of the Punic Wars, their presence was a quiet but constant reassurance that Rome's hand reached everywhere the sea touched. Influence on later navies. The legacy of Roman warships outlived the empire itself. The Byzantine navy, inheriting Roman traditions, continued to dominate the eastern Mediterranean for centuries, adapting galleys into the powerful dromon, armed with the terrifying weapon of Greek fire. Medieval and Renaissance galleys owed much to Roman designs. The reliance on oars, the use of boarding tactics, and even the layout of crews followed patterns established in antiquity. Rome had not invented the galley, but it had perfected the art of adapting naval warfare to the needs of an empire. Modern memory and archaeology. Today, the story of Rome's naval dominance survives not only in books and ruins, but also beneath the sea. Archaeologists have discovered wrecks of Roman ships lying silent on the seabed, their timbers preserved by sand and silt, their cargoes of amphorae still intact. Bronze rams have been raised from the depths, some still bearing the scars of battle, testimony to the violent clashes of galleys long vanished. In museums, reconstructions and models bring these ships back to life for modern audiences. Scholars continue to debate details of their construction, but the image of a Roman quinquereme cutting across the Mediterranean remains as powerful today as it was over 2,000 years ago. Conclusion: masters of Mare Nostrum. Roman warships were not only tools of conquest, but also foundations of identity. They secured the empire's borders, carried its legions to distant shores, and turned the Mediterranean into a Roman lake. Their story is one of innovation, adaptation, and persistence. From the rough shipyards of the First Punic War to the elegance of imperial fleets, Roman warships reflect the broader character of Rome itself: pragmatic, relentless, and determined to transform the world. Even now, when we look upon the ruins of Roman harbors or the recovered relics of ancient rams and anchors, we are reminded that Rome's mastery was built not only on land, but on the restless, glittering expanse of the sea.